A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
This is Andrew McLennan. Recently in Australia, 120 Christian leaders, including many pastors, wrote a letter in support of the Palestinian people at the expense of Israel, who is currently engaged in a war for its survival against a terrorist organisation called Hamas, which sadly is taking place in Gaza, and innocent people are suffering in that war. But to give us her perspective on this open letter is Rachael Torrington from the Never Again Is Now movement. Rachael, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure, Rachael. Tell us in a nutshell what this controversial letter was saying.
So the letter basically addressed all the buzzwords. It talked about how there's the hospitals being bombed, about the scale in Israel's response, about the number of casualties, about the checkpoints, about the catastrophic damage to infrastructure, about the displaced people, all the usual buzzwords that you hear coming out in regards to what's happening between Israel and Gaza.
Yeah, and you recognised some of these people who've signed because of the training you've done in a theological college. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. So I was, the letter was brought to my attention originally through people with Never Again Is Now and the Never Again Is Now community. And when I went to look at it further, I discovered that many of the people that had signed it were previous lectures of mine at Moline Baptist Theological College. I also went on to some of the lecturers' Facebook pages and discovered that they were promoting what they had signed and were very proud of what they were signed. And naturally, I was gutted by this, absolutely gutted.
Yeah, and so what they want Israel to do is to stop the war, which is taking place in Gaza against Hamas. Is that correct?
Correct. So they were talking about how Israel was attacking hospitals and things like that, and how the ceasefire there had to stop. I addressed that. I informed them that all of this was Hamas propaganda, and there's ample evidence of this. That there are weapons being held in schools and hospitals, that the hospital is being used as a base for the hostages. They discussed the amount of casualties. Again, they were falling for Hamas propaganda. Much of the casualties, many of the numbers are numbers coming from Hamas themselves, and there has been evidence that a lot of the footage and the photos and the pictures that they're using aren't even from the Gaza war. Many of them are from the Syrian war. They discussed about the land seizures and the checkpoints. They discussed for a ceasefire, yet seem to forget that it's Hamas that continuously rejects the ceasefire. That they call for a ceasefire, but without the release of hostages. It's very, very one-sided. They discuss how they want peace between Gaza and Israel, and we all want peace between Gaza and Israel, but you cannot have a two-state solution with Hamas in control. You can't do it. That would mean not only the end of Israel, that would mean the end of Jews throughout the world, followed by Christians, followed by the infidels. It would mean the end of Western civilization and Judeo-Christian values as we know it. That is what a two-state solution and a ceasefire with Hamas would mean.
Yeah, well, you raised some really good points there. I want to just go back, just so our listeners understand. The Palestinian Health Authority are the ones releasing the numbers of alleged victims of this war in Gaza. Just tell our listeners who controls the Palestinian Health Authority.
So Hamas is in control of the Palestinian Health Authority, as well as you have other groups that are involved, like Hezbollah and everyone that falls under those brackets. You've also got UNRWA, which is in control of a lot of the stuff that comes out there. And as many would know in recent times, UNRWA is not the same as the UN. They are their own individual group that has been created for the Palestinian people and are controlled by terrorists. And they are the ones that are giving the numbers out. They're the numbers that are being reported again and again in the media. They discuss teenagers and children that are killed, but what they conveniently leave out is when they're discussing the teenagers that are being killed. They're teenagers that have been trained to be full-fledged soldiers. You're talking about like 15, 16-year-olds. And while that's devastating in itself, that is not Israel's fault. That falls on Hamas. And they are the numbers that you see coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, because these titles like UNRWA and the Palestinian Health officials, it sounds very legit, doesn't it? But you've just got to drill down. Yeah, you've just got to drill down a little bit. And you soon realize, well, Hamas is an organization that even within Gaza itself, when they were elected the first time, they literally just killed all their opposition, didn't they? So there is no political opposition in Gaza right now because Hamas has literally terminated all of their opposition and they are controlling Gaza with an iron fist. And we all know that billions of dollars has gone into Gaza to help rebuild and help the Palestinian people. But we also know that the leaders of Hamas, some of them billionaires now, living in Qatar and different parts of the world. So it's really just a case of people need to dig a little bit deeper, don't they, Rachel, to find out the facts?
Absolutely. Like one of the things that was being discussed in the actual letter was the infrastructure and the shortage of food and aid coming in. And if you dig that little bit further, you would discover that the reason why there is no infrastructure is because Hamas spent the money that was coming in on tunnels and weapons. The reason why there's no food or aid being provided is not because of the shortage coming in. It's because Hamas is taking that food and aid and selling it at such high prices that the Palestinian people can't afford the food that's meant to be for free. And this is what we keep hearing in the Western media is I do not deny that there are innocent people there, and my heart bleeds for them, but I know who it is that is destroying their people. Hamas hates the Jewish people. Hamas hates the Christian people. Hamas hates their own people. Yeah,
absolutely. And, there is some historical parallels to this. That is in the 1940s, the Western world, not even the Western world, the Russians, the communist Russian nation was involved as well. The Allies, they were called, decided that Nazism was an evil that had to be eradicated because, let's be honest, if Hitler had been given another 5 years through ceasefires and time to think and come back to offers, his scientists may well have developed a nuclear weapon. And had they done that, the Nazis, we all know what they would have done. They would have bombed the major cities around Europe and just bombed Europe into submission and then moved on to America. And so Nazism had to be eradicated. Now, it's estimated that in the war against the Nazis, about 500,000 civilians were sadly killed in that war because the Russians had to come in from the east and the British and the Americans had to come in from the west. And unfortunately, in war, it's an ugly thing. Civilians die, and no one wanted that. But they had to eradicate Nazism, didn't they?
They did, and it's interesting that you actually mentioned the 500,000 figure, because that figure in itself was inflated figures, such as what we have today. The person that was asked to give the numbers at that time was a Holocaust denier who later on, I think around 1966, actually announced that the documentation that he had worked on had been forged, and the real numbers were much, much, much lower than what you had just reported. And again, this is what we see happening now. Hamas inflates the civilian death figures in the same manner. A perfect example of this is when the hospital was apparently bombed. Within minutes around the world, it was stating that there were something like 500 deaths within the hospital. One, how can somebody know the death count in a matter of seconds or minutes? Two, the hospital wasn't even bombed, yet that data got out into the media throughout the world. Thankfully, that particular case was corrected, but there are many, many numbers and cases that still aren't corrected and that the Western world believes, and there is a history of this.
Yeah, and look, I haven't read that report you mentioned in the 60s when the truth came out. I think you're referring to Dresden's bombing that they said 100,000 died. But even forgetting Germany, I mean, lots of French civilians died, lots of Belgium. Like
Absolutely.
we look at movies like Saving Private Ryan when the Allies invaded the Normandy coast. But from that time until they reached Berlin, lots of innocent Belgium and Dutch and French civilians also died in bombings because the Allies just had to march on to destroy Nazism. And it's so sad. And no one's saying it's a good thing. And unfortunately, it's happening in Gaza now. But it's like these sort of, I don't know, a lot of people are getting caught up in the emotion, aren't they, instead of the facts and just dealing with what is actually happening.
Well, war's horrific. There is no two ways about it. War is horrific. But sometimes you have no choice but to fight to survive. And when you are fighting, we're not praising, we're not celebrating and praising the people that die. We're celebrating that we're still alive. And that's a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great there's organisations out there like Never Again is now that provide support to the Jewish people who live here in Australia. Can you give us an update on what Never Again is now is doing in Australia now?
Never Again is mostly focusing on anti-Semitism within Australia. While many of our members and part of the community do support what's happening in Israel, we are trying to keep the two things separate. We do have Israelis working with us, and we are working very closely with groups such as Together with Israel, but our main focus is anti-Semitism within Australia. And the reason why we're focusing on that is because we've discovered, I was actually on the church calling team, we've discovered that many of the churches within Australia don't understand the connection between the Jewish people and the people in Israel. Many churches have never met a Jewish person. Throughout Christmas, you would have seen many people claim that Jesus was a Palestinian. There's a lot of misinformation out there within the churches, and we need to start at the beginning with so many of them. Start at the beginning, teaching them that the Jews of today are the Jews of the Bible. We're all praying to the same God. We're all praying, Christians and Jews, to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that is what Never Again is about teaching the churches to stand with the Jewish people for the same God in Australia. Our next rally will be in Melbourne, and we are hoping that this is a big event, especially with the anti-Semitism that we're seeing there at the moment. It's toxic. It's absolutely toxic, and the state is very much moving away from those Judeo-Christian values.
Yeah, well, it's great to see organisations and individuals within your organisation, Never Again is now, standing up for love, standing up for truth, and standing up for the Jewish people who are probably the most persecuted minority in the world right now. There just feels like there's a whole movement against the Jewish people, and and we can see that they've really got their backs up against the wall now. We've had missiles launched at them over the weekend from Iran.
Yeah.
But Rachael Torrington, I just want to thank you so much for joining us on 2020 Today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.